On the 28th of February, a political era did not merely pause, it ended abruptly. Ayatollah Khamenei is no longer alive. When a leader who shaped a pivotal nation for decades disappears in the center of an escalating war, the world does not simply move on, it recalculates. It freezes. It braces for the shockwave. We are no longer speaking about a single military strike in the Middle East. We are speaking about a colossal power vacuum inside one of the most strategic nations on this planet. The confrontation between Iran and Israel, already dangerous, has now crossed the threshold into a deeply unpredictable phase. History teaches us a brutal, unyielding truth. When long-standing authority collapses during an active confrontation, stability is never the immediate successor. There is hesitation, there is internal maneuvering, there is relentless pressure from outside forces waiting, like vultures, to influence what comes next. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. If this story resonates, show your support with a like, a comment, or a subscription. It means more than numbers. It keeps the story alive. This is not merely about a transition of power within one border. This is about the future alignment of the entire Middle East. It is about the arteries of global trade, the vital oil routes, and the intricate web of alliances that dictate whether this war expands into a global inferno or eventually stabilizes. For a leader from the global south, observing these tectonic shifts is not a casual exercise. Whenever global powers reposition themselves, smaller nations must either prepare or perish. My brothers and sisters, listen carefully to the rhythm of this changing world. When a leader rules for decades, his presence ceases to be just a man. It becomes the very structure of the state itself. He was not simply a political figure. Since 1989, he was the central pillar shaping ideological, military, and strategic directions. He forged a posture toward foreign adversaries and cemented deep alliances across the region. Now that he is gone, the fundamental question is not whether the nation survives. The fundamental question is how it reorganizes itself in the shadows. In systems where authority is tightly bound to a single center, succession is a battlefield of its own. There are religious institutions, there are military factions, particularly the Revolutionary Guard. There are political actors who have waited patiently in the dark for their moment of influence. Each of these pillars now calculates its position with cold precision. The outside world will immediately search for weakness. That is the harsh, unforgiving reality of geopolitics. Adversaries will measure the military response. Superpowers will assess whether deterrence has strengthened or crumbled into dust. Regional neighbors will quietly analyze the shifting balance of power. But here is the bare truth that so many international analysts conveniently overlook. A power vacuum does not automatically equate to collapse. Sometimes it produces a terrifying consolidation. Sometimes it breeds a much harder, more aggressive line of defense. If the emerging leadership believes that strength must be demonstrated instantly to deter scavengers, we may witness a rapid escalation. If internal stability becomes the absolute priority, we might see a deceptive, temporary pause in external confrontation. This moment is exquisitely delicate. It is not only about who takes the seat of power, it is about the message that replacement broadcasts to the world. When war begins between two heavily armed actors, the illusion sold to the public is always identical. Leaders stand at their podiums and promise their people that the conflict will be limited, controlled, and surgically precise. But history shows us a drastically different portrait. Once the cycle of retaliation is set into motion, the battlefield invariably bleeds far beyond its original lines. The tension was already suffocating before the 28th of February. There were covert operations happening in the shadows. There were cyber disruptions crippling infrastructure, details of which remain largely missing from the public eye. There were proxy engagements testing the waters. But after this monumental death, the psychological barrier has been fundamentally shattered. The stakes are no longer confined to military targets. They have become deeply symbolic. they are now existential. Missiles lighting up the night sky are not just weapons of destruction. They are messages written in fire. Every strike now carries a profound strategic meaning. When one side acts, it signals deterrence. When the other responds, it signals unyielding resilience. When allied groups mobilize, they signal unwavering alignment. And when global powers suddenly reposition their naval fleets or activate their air defenses, they signal desperate preparation for something significantly larger. The danger looming over us is not only the horror of direct confrontation. The true creeping danger is miscalculation. A single arrogant overreach can drag peaceful countries into an open engagement. Shipping routes, the very lifelines of global survival, can be disrupted overnight. Energy markets, fragile and volatile, react in the blink of an eye. Old alliances harden like concrete. This is precisely why we must understand that this war is no longer contained within its original borders. It is about influence corridors. It is about security doctrines. It is about the global perception of strength. And in the ruthless theater of geopolitics, perception is very often as powerful as reality itself. As the great powers focus their gaze on the shifting sands of the Middle East, a massive, silent trap is being set for the developing world. They expect the nations of Africa and the global south to absorb the economic shockwaves, to pay the inflated prices, and to grovel for salvation. They expect us to surrender our dignity, but they do not realize that the soil of our resistance has already been turned. Will we step blindly into their geopolitical trap, or is this the precise moment the paradigm shifts forever? The Middle East is not watching casually. Every capital is calculating whether this monumental succession leads to chaotic unpredictability or a hardened, impenetrable resolve. This is not simply a religious transition behind closed doors, it is a geopolitical pivot point of the highest magnitude. Whenever the Middle East shifts its weight, the world economy listens with bated breath. This region is not only a battlefield of ideology and security, it is the vital artery of global energy flow. The Strait of Hormuz alone carries a significant percentage of the world's oil shipments, even if the exact metric of daily disruption remains missing from the sterile reports of Western analysts. When tensions rise between regional powers, the domino effect is instant, ruthless, and entirely unforgiving. Insurance rates for maritime vessels skyrocket overnight. Shipping routes are frantically reassessed by panic-stricken executives. Markets respond before the ink on diplomatic cables is even dry. You will see endless headlines about crude prices. You will hear financial analysts discuss supply chains in air-conditioned studios. But behind those technical discussions is a darker, deeper reality. Control of energy corridors influences global leverage. If instability spreads, global powers will not remain distant, passive observers. Naval deployments increase. Strategic reserves are nervously evaluated. Diplomatic pressure intensifies to a fever pitch. Every major economy understands that a prolonged disruption could ripple far beyond the desert sands. But here is the stark truth that history repeatedly demonstrates. When large powers reposition themselves around energy security, they entirely neglect the voices of the developing nations that depend on stable pricing. Africa, Asia, Latin America. These regions feel the impact first. It does not arrive with the sound of artillery. It arrives silently, through crippling inflation, soaring transport costs, and skyrocketing food prices. For decades, conflicts in strategic regions have been deceptively framed as isolated, distant disputes, yet the consequences always travel across oceans and borders with devastating speed. Economic sanctions expand, global financial systems tighten their grip, supply chains brutally adjust to protect the wealthy while starving the vulnerable. Smaller nations are then arrogantly ordered to choose sides, even when they had absolutely no role in the creation of the confrontation. This is the ultimate enduring injustice of the modern era. Or the giants clash in their quest for dominance, and the global south is forced to pay the heavy bill. Let us take a moment here, not to rush forward, but to give thanks. Write a comment with a simple thank you to Traore, to Burkina Faso, or to the spirit of sovereignty itself. Gratitude is not a formality, it is recognition, it is dignity expressed in words. When you add your voice of thanks, you are not just engaging with a video, you are standing in solidarity with a story of freedom and pride. So before we continue, take this pause to comment your thank you. Together, those words become a beacon that shines far beyond the screen. This brings us to a defining realization about the nature of modern power. The conflict reshaping the geopolitical map is not only about military strength or the range of ballistic missiles, it is about relentless economic pressure, the monopolization of strategic trade routes, and the bitter contest over who gets to dictate the future international order. When major powers collide, the global south must listen carefully, but it must no longer listen in quiet submission. It is in this precise crucible of global instability that the perspective of leaders like Ibrahim Traore resonates with absolute, undeniable clarity. He understands that whenever global powers reposition themselves to protect their own interests, smaller nations are historically crushed in the shifting gears of empire. Yet the narrative is actively changing. The demand for sovereignty, for true and uncompromised independence, is no longer a distant whisper, it is a resounding declaration. No continent should depend entirely on corridors it does not control. No nation should be forced into a suffocating alignment simply because its energy supply has become a bargaining chip on someone else's negotiating table. We have seen this pattern too many times. Africa has learned deeply painful lessons from being caught in the geopolitical crossfire of foreign superpowers. We have seen how global rivalries can instantly destabilize currency, inflate commodity prices, and apply unbearable political pressure on sovereign governments. That is why the concept of sovereignty must be treated not as a hollow political slogan, but as an impenetrable shield. When the balance of power violently shifts in the Middle East, the resulting ripple effect tests the fundamental resilience of every developing economy on Earth. Those who are prepared, those who have built their own independent foundations, will navigate the severe turbulence. Those who remain dependent on the goodwill of foreign masters will feel every single shockwave shatter their internal stability. Before we reveal the next chapter, which is perhaps the most powerful assertion of sovereignty you will ever hear, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If this channel has moved you, if these stories are touching something deep in your spirit, then consider becoming a member. Not for exclusive content or perks, but because supporting this channel is directly supporting narratives that mainstream media refuses to tell. Every membership is a vote for Sankara's Echo's mission. Every member becomes a co-creator of the revolution we are documenting. Join us. Stand with the principle that African wealth belongs to Africa. The death of a supreme leader and the subsequent terrifying escalation between regional arch-rivals will undeniably reshape global alliances in the coming months. Some states, driven by historical fear and economic fragility, will double down on their traditional, unequal partnerships. The architects of the old world order fully expect the developing nations to panic. They expect leaders in the global south to approach them on bended knee, begging for financial aid and emergency relief to survive the impending storm of global inflation. They anticipate subservience, but they have forgotten one core, unshakable principle of the human spirit. Sovereignty is not a commodity that can be traded for temporary comfort, and true freedom cannot be purchased with generational debt. Will the overwhelming pressure crush the dream of independence, or is the foundation of a new resistance already too strong to break? The geopolitical earthquake triggered on the 28th of February was expected to shatter the resolve of the developing world. In the sterile boardrooms of Western financial institutions and the heavily guarded corridors of global superpowers, the calculation was simple. They believed that the escalating confrontation in the Middle East, the sudden disruption of energy corridors, and the terrifying spike in global inflation would force smaller nations back into a state of absolute compliance. They anticipated a familiar historical script. A crisis erupts in the north or the east. The economic shockwaves violently strike the global south, and the leaders of developing nations are forced to travel to foreign capitals, holding out their hands, begging for the financial aid required to save their collapsing economies. They expected panic. They expected a desperate scramble for foreign loans. But they were looking at the wrong map, and they were listening to the wrong voices. The true response to this global instability is not being drafted in the panic rooms of Western banks. It is being forged in the very heart of West Africa. We are witnessing a profound and irreversible pivot in the global order. For decades, the African continent has been treated as a mere spectator to the conflicts of giants, a collateral casualty in the endless wars for global dominance. When foreign supply chains broke, African markets bled. Yet, from this historical vulnerability, a powerful counterweight has miraculously emerged. It is a rejection of the victim narrative. It is a fierce, unapologetic assertion of strategic autonomy. At the center of this awakening stands Ibrahim Traore, representing not just a single nation, but an entirely new paradigm of leadership. When he speaks of the shifting dynamics in the Middle East, he is not analyzing a distant war. He is diagnosing a global sickness of dependency. He looks at the crumbling international order not as a terrifying catastrophe, but as the ultimate opportunity to permanently sever the chains of neo-colonial reliance. This is where Burkina Faso transcends its geographical borders. It is no longer just a nation situated on the map of West Africa. It has become the undeniable beacon of a bloodless resistance. This is a resistance not defined by the destructive force of weaponry, but by the unyielding reclamation of sovereign dignity. It is a systematic dismantling of the invisible architectures that have kept the continent impoverished while its resources enriched the rest of the globe. The specific, intricate details of the newly drafted economic pacts and the exact metric tonnage of national gold reserves recently reclaimed from foreign vaults remain missing from the mainstream international headlines. But the monumental symbolic victory is impossible to ignore. Burkina Faso is demonstrating to the entire global south that a nation does not have to remain a permanent hostage to the fluctuating moods of distant empires. To understand the sheer magnitude of this defiance, we must look beyond the abstract concepts of geopolitics and look down at the very earth beneath our feet. For generations, the developing world has been brutally conditioned to wait for the harvest of others. When a crisis strikes the energy routes or the wheat fields of foreign continents, we are immediately told to brace for inevitable starvation. But you cannot build a sovereign, unshakable nation on borrowed wheat. You cannot secure the future of your children by desperately begging for the seeds of your historical oppressors. True independence is not a document signed in a European capital. True independence demands that we place our own hands into our own soil. It demands that we boldly plant our own seeds, nurtured fiercely by our own resources and protected by our own resolve. We must cultivate our own land so that when the global markets inevitably burn and the foreign supply ships stop sailing, our people can still reap a bountiful, sovereign harvest. This philosophy of self-reliance is terrifying to the architects of the old world order. A continent that feeds itself, defends itself, and finances itself is a continent that can no longer be controlled. And the empires of old do not surrender their hunting grounds without a vicious struggle. They realize that the era of direct military subjugation is fading, so they have adapted. They have replaced the brute force of infantry with the silent, suffocating violence of economic warfare. The pressure currently mounting against this movement of absolute sovereignty is immense and relentless. The retaliatory maneuvers are rarely visible to the public eye. They exist in the sudden cancellation of development programs. They manifest in the orchestrated destabilization of local currencies. They take the shape of diplomatic isolation, where international bodies are weaponized to brand any assertion of independence as a threat to global stability. The global powers are systematically attempting to build an invisible wall around the nations that dare to chart an independent course, hoping to starve the rebellion before it can spread to neighboring borders. They calculate that without the lifeline of foreign capital, the resolve of the people will inevitably crumble. They expect the citizens of these awakening nations to eventually grow tired of the struggle, to look at the mounting economic hardships, and to demand a return to the comfortable chains of dependency. The international community is holding its collective breath, watching this high-stakes confrontation unfold in real time. The geopolitical chessboard has been violently overturned and the old rules no longer apply. They expect the pressure to break us. They think that by systematically cutting off the oxygen of international finance, they can force a proud people to surrender without firing a single shot. The old forces are closing their grip, confident that their economic siege will bring this uprising of dignity to a quiet, tragic end. The monumental question hovering over the entire continent is this: can this steadfast resilience, this unwavering commitment to the soil, actually survive the suffocating, invisible sanctions of a desperate, dying empire? The retaliation from the old world order is rarely televised. It does not arrive with the dramatic sound of marching infantry or the terrifying roar of fighter jets filling the sky. It is far more insidious. The modern empire strikes back through the silent, suffocating machinery of economic warfare. When a nation dares to stand upright and reclaim its sovereignty, the international financial system is immediately weaponized against it. Sovereign assets are suddenly frozen in overseas accounts. International trade agreements are inexplicably delayed or unilaterally cancelled. The exact billions of national wealth currently trapped within Western banking systems remain missing from the sterile reports of global financial institutions. But the intent behind this confiscation is undeniable. It is a calculated strategy of starvation. It is a bloodless war waged in air-conditioned boardrooms, designed to break the spirit of a newly liberated people so that they inevitably turn against their own liberation. Know that the first and most painful step of true liberation is accepting the severe punishment that always follows. The oppressors demand a high price for freedom. They calculate everything in terms of currency, deficits, and inflation rates. They expect that when the development programs are cut and the foreign aid is abruptly halted, the people will panic. They anticipate that the citizens will look at the engineered scarcity, feel the bite of economic isolation, and desperately demand the return of their foreign masters. They believe that a nation cannot survive outside the carefully constructed cage of neo-colonial reliance. Take a second right here to tell us where you are watching from. Type the name of your city, your land, the soil beneath your feet, and as you do, know this: Sankara's echo sends you not just thanks, but a blessing. For strength in your hands, for pride in your heart, for light on the road ahead. The comments below become a map of connection, showing that this message reaches far beyond borders. The architects of this financial siege fundamentally misunderstand the people they are trying to break. They look at the developing world through the lens of spreadsheets and dependency models. They do not comprehend the raw, unstoppable power of calloused hands. For generations, the wealth of the continent was extracted by invisible systems, leaving behind nothing but broken promises and depleted earth. But true independence is not a gift handed down on a silver platter by a benevolent foreign power. It is carved out of the unforgiving earth. It is built by those calloused hands working tirelessly to reconstruct a sovereign nation from the smoldering ashes of a deeply exploitative system. The people are no longer waiting for foreign saviors to build their infrastructure or dictate their economic policies. They are taking ownership of their own destiny, brick by brick, field by field. The road ahead is undeniably long, and it is fraught with engineered peril. It is a road paved with economic hardship, diplomatic isolation, and relentless psychological pressure from the international community. But for the very first time in generations, the people are not walking blindly in the dark. They are no longer guided by the false, flickering promises of conditional foreign aid. There is a brilliant, undeniable light illuminating this road. It is the light of absolute self-determination. When a population finally realizes that their historical poverty was not an accident of geography, but a carefully engineered mechanism of control, their endurance suddenly transforms into a formidable weapon. They are willing to endure the temporary pain of isolation because they know it is the only pathway to permanent freedom. This is the profound systemic failure of the oppressor. They measure breaking points using algorithms and economic forecasts. But human dignity cannot be quantified on a balance sheet. The fierce burning willingness to suffer today for a tomorrow that belongs entirely to you is a variable their sophisticated models simply cannot process. The leadership has made a definitive choice to endure the storm rather than seek shelter under the fragile umbrella of the old empire. They are dismantling the deeply ingrained psychological complexes that taught an entire continent to view itself as inherently inferior and chronically dependent. They thought that by severing the financial lifeline, they could suffocate the nation into a quiet, tragic submission. They thought they were locking the doors to the global economy, trapping the people in a permanent prison of manufactured poverty. They believed that cutting off international aid would starve the revolution of its energy, but they were catastrophically wrong. By aggressively cutting the chains of dependency, they did not starve the nation. They accidentally set it free. They thought they were punishing a small rebellion, but they did not realize they were unleashing the most terrifying power on the continent. When we look back at the history of the global south, there is a profound, lingering outrage that cannot be easily silenced. For decades, entire generations were sold a devastating, beautifully packaged lie. They were told that prosperity would eventually trickle down from the high tables of Western capitals, provided they remained obedient and quiet. We mourn the lost years. We look at the staggering wealth extracted from African soil, the exact trillions in natural resources that remain permanently missing from the official ledgers of former colonial empires, and we feel the heavy, suffocating weight of a manufactured poverty. We traded our raw materials for the grand illusion of progress. We traded our sovereignty for the crippling generational chains of foreign debt. It was never a true partnership, despite the endless diplomatic smiles and the carefully drafted international treaties. It was a highly sophisticated system of survival, meticulously designed to keep the continent perpetually on its knees, always waiting for the next geopolitical crisis in the Middle East or Europe to dictate the price of its daily bread. The regret for those lost decades is deep, but it is no longer a paralyzing force. It has metamorphosed into an unstoppable fuel. The era of unipolar domination is collapsing before our very eyes, crashing down under the weight of its own historical arrogance. When geopolitical earthquakes strike, like the sudden disappearance of a supreme leader in a highly contested region, the deep fractures in the old world order become absolutely impossible to hide. The traditional empires are dangerously overextended. Their financial weapons, once thought to be invincible, are rapidly losing their edge as the developing world learns to bypass them. In this chaotic, fracturing reality, a multipolar world is no longer merely a theoretical concept debated in the safe confines of Western universities. It is a tangible, living revolution. It is being aggressively forged right now, not by the charitable grace of superpowers, but by the relentless, iron-willed determination of nations utterly refusing to be used as disposable pawns on a global chessboard. The road ahead is demanding, but it is finally illuminated by a fierce, uncompromising demand for dignity. We are witnessing the painful but glorious birth of true independence, where nations are actively seeking to forge new alliances based on genuine mutual respect, rather than systemic coercion and economic blackmail. The old powers continue to demand subservience, threatening starvation and isolation to those who disobey. But the new world, rising from the ashes of neocolonialism, demands absolute equality. Look at the calloused hands steadily rebuilding the fractured infrastructure of a historically forgotten continent. They are no longer reaching out for conditional foreign charity. They are digging deep into their own rich earth. This is the ultimate irreversible reclamation of power. Every domestic factory built, every local supply chain fiercely secured, every ounce of gold retained within sovereign borders is a powerful seed planted for the future. We are cultivating a reality where the harvest will no longer be exported to enrich foreign investors while the local population starves. The harvest will finally, rightfully, belong to the children of the continent. The light at the end of this arduous road is not the artificial, fading glow of Western approval. It is the blinding, undeniable light of absolute freedom. The oppressors thought they could easily break the spirit of a rising, defiant people by simply cutting off the financial tap. Instead, they awoke a sleeping giant that will never again accept the bitter indignity of invisible chains. As we prepare to end, remember, this is not the end of the road, but a seed planted in the soil of your heart. Every story of dignity, every voice of sovereignty is part of a harvest that lies ahead. If you want to see that harvest grow, subscribe. Let this channel be the road we walk together, the light we carry forward. Your subscription is not for us alone, it is for the promise of what is still to come. Join us and be ready for the next chapter that is already waiting to be written. The geopolitical shockwaves of the Middle East will continue to tremble across the globe, but the response from the global south has fundamentally and permanently changed. We are no longer helpless victims waiting for the storm of foreign conflicts to pass. The uncompromising vision laid out by Ibrahim Traore has proven that true sovereignty is the only impenetrable shield against a deeply chaotic world. When history looks back at this definitive turning point, it will not merely record the fall of distant leaders or the volatile fluctuation of international oil markets. It will record the precise moment a historically marginalized nation stood up against the towering, threatening giants of the old world order. The fierce, unyielding stance of Burkina Faso has ignited a fire of self-determination that simply cannot be extinguished by economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or political sabotage. The unipolar era is dead, and the future inevitably belongs to those who have the courage to claim it. The profound message from Ibrahim Traore echoes across the continents with crystal clarity. The era of begging is decisively over. The magnificent era of sovereignty has begun.